We are just over 2 weeks away from the Seattle Kraken expansion draft in the NHL's 32nd franchise. Today we're going to take a look at a lot of the rumors surrounding what players are going to be available and some of the big names that they just might select. We'll jump into that coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, today we're taking a look at some Seattle Kraken rumors ahead of the expansion draft, which is just over 2 weeks away. Now, it's exactly 2 weeks to the day when we're going to have a roster freeze, so a trade and waiver freeze is what they're calling it, on July the 17th, which is 14 days from today, where teams are not going to be able to make any more adjustments to their rosters, and obviously their players that they're protecting are going to have to be submitted, and then the Kraken will have a little bit of time to decide who they're selecting. Then, of course, a few days later on the 21st, the Kraken will submit their list to the NHL, and all will be revealed at the expansion draft, and we'll know who is going to be on the initial roster. Now, just like we saw with the Vegas Golden Knights, a lot of the players that they select will indeed play in Season 1, and a lot of players are going to be selected and then traded. That's bound to be happening here. You're not going to need 30 NHL quality players for your first season. They're bound to select a lot of players for exactly that purpose, and it wouldn't be surprising if they have side deals worked out ahead of time with other teams saying, we'll select them, and then they already have a side trade worked out. That would not be surprising at all. So of course, the Seattle Kraken are only getting 30 NHL players, even though there's 31 NHL teams, because the Vegas Golden Knights are exempt from this process since they are a newer franchise, and that was part of their agreement when they first joined the NHL just over 4 years ago. So as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at some of the bigger names that are going to be available and rumored that the Kraken might consider selecting or take via trade. But before we do that, I want to take a look here first at some information that came out in the last 24 hours. It was a quote from CEO Todd Leiweke talking about the fact that GM Ron Francis is going to be given all the resources he needs, and that the Kraken are indeed willing to spend right to the cap if that's going to be what it takes to make this team as competitive as possible for the longer term. Obviously, they put a lot of work into getting this franchise off the ground, putting in a new arena. They want their fans to be happy, of course, and they're going to do their best to be competitive right away. And spending to the cap is available to Francis if he indeed feels that is necessary. So that leads us to think that they will be open to be taking on at least a few bigger names that are higher salary, possibly even with a little bit of term as well. I think some bigger salaried names with shorter terms might be even more attractive, but we'll jump into that here momentarily. So let's take a look at some of the players that are rumored to be made exposed through the expansion draft, or that the Kraken are available to either sign or trade for as well, and have been linked to in recent rumors. So getting started, let's take a look first at the New York Islanders. It's believed that a player like Nick Leddy on defense, who's down to 1 year left on his contract of just over $5 million, or a forward like Jordan Eberle will also be made available to the Kraken. Now, of course, we don't have any rumors to suggest they're definitely going to select one of them, but I know that Ron Francis is likely to build from the back end out. He's obviously did that when he was a Carolina Hurricanes general manager, and look at the blue line they have today. A lot of what they have there was his doing while he was there during his tenure. So I do suspect that the Kraken are going to take a lot of D. Now, of course, keep in mind that there is a minimum number of players at each position that they are required to take. They have 30 players that they will select. 14 of them have to be forwards, 9 of them have to be defense, and 3 of them have to be goaltenders. So if you do the math there, that only adds up to 26. So obviously there's an additional 4 players that can be of any position. Doesn't really matter how they slice it up. But my guess would be 14 forwards is more than enough, that they're likely going to take at least 3 of those extra 4 guys will be D, and maybe they'll take a 4th goaltender, depending on how they feel about some of the players. But I would suspect that Ron Francis and the Kraken leave the expansion draft with at least 12, maybe 13 defensemen on their roster. Of course, you can only play 6 at a time. You're bound to have maybe a couple go to their minors. Another night, you're going to see a bunch of them that are pretty decent players actually end up getting traded, and they can stock up on some picks and prospects through that method as well, just like we saw what Vegas did when they went through this just a short time ago. So I think Islanders fans are probably happy and accepting the fact that maybe Leddy or Eberle could end up on the Kraken's roster. I do think Leddy would be more likely, given the fact he's down to 1 year in his deal, where Jordan Eberle is down to 3 years and at $5 million as well. But as I mentioned in our New York Islanders offseason plan video, I think the Islanders really do need an upgrade on the wing position to play with Matthew Barzal. I know they'll have Captain Anders Lee coming back, which is an option for them. Obviously, deadline acquisition Kyle Palmieri may not return due to cap constraints, so it wouldn't be shocking if they do try to move on from Eberle to be able to find a more dynamic winger. But I guess that might be wishful thinking, but it's a real possibility here based on what their needs are. Now, it's also believed that a couple of big-name players with big-ticket items on the Flyers will be available to the Kraken, and there's been some rumors around each one possibly being linked there. Now, one would be James Van Riemsdyk, who has $7 million left on his contract for 2 more years. Now, of course, JVR has previously been coached by Dave Haxtell, so there is a connection there. And there's also some that believe that Jacob Voracek will be made available as well. Now, he comes with a bigger ticket here, $8.25 million for another 3 years. He's been a guy that every time the Flyers seem to struggle, it gets linked to trade rumors and being moved out, and it wouldn't be shocking if they did indeed do that this year. Given the season that the Flyers just came off of, I think that they probably could stand to have a bit of a shake-up there, and Voracek obviously makes a lot of money, but you know what? You can say what you want about him. He's been a very productive guy. If you look at a lot of the stats over the last even 4 or 5 years, like he would be top 10 in a lot of categories for his position. So to me, he's still a productive guy. It would be a tremendous pickup for Seattle if they're willing to take on that salary. And like I said, with the fact that they're willing to spend to the cap, I can see there being at least a couple of players, 2-3 guys on this team making possibly, $7-8 million bucks. Wouldn't be a complete shocker here. And Voracek is a guy that I think they would be seriously considering. Now, another guy to keep an eye on as well is Dougie Hamilton. Now, he's likely not going to be selected in the expansion draft, but it is possible because the way things work when it comes to free agents is even if they're UFA or RFA, there will be a period of time when the Kraken can speak to any of those players without contracts that were not protected by their existing teams. And obviously, UFA technically doesn't have an existing team, but obviously their old team could technically choose to protect them because their contract's not officially expired. The expansion draft is June 21st. Contracts are not officially expired till June 27th, and free agency kicks in the next day on the 28th. So, like, for example, the Hurricanes could still protect Hamilton, giving them the exclusive negotiating rights until that period kicks in. But as we know, they've already given him permission to speak with other teams and work out a potential trade or sign and trade or anything like that. So it's really, not a foregone conclusion that he leaves. I think the hope for the Hurricanes is that he doesn't find something better out there and decides to come back to them for whatever it was they offered. I do think that they would be very interested in keeping him, but it's going to prove challenging given how good he's been, that he certainly could price himself out of Carolina what they're willing to pay. And the Kraken have been a team that have been rumored to be very interested in this guy. Now, if they do leave him exposed because he's not signed, then the Kraken can talk to him if they work out a contract. That can be their pick. So, I mean, from the Hurricane side of things, if they feel like they're going to lose him anyway, then it might not be a terrible thing to have him go to Seattle so they don't lose an additional player on top of that. But if Seattle chooses not to go down the road of Hamilton, they could choose a different player, and Dougie could end up walking anyway, and they could technically be down 2 guys. So from a Hurricanes perspective, if he's going to walk, you probably would rather see him go to the Kraken in this scenario, but obviously they don't have the cap constraints that other teams do. Knowing the fact that GM Ron Francis is likely going to want to focus hard on the blue line in the beginning, what better guy around the league that would be available to likely be your top pair right shot defenseman? Dougie Hamilton would be a tremendous pickup. So he's been linked there, and it wouldn't be surprising to see them be the ones to pay him and get him to be one of their star players from the get-go. Now, another guy that's likely going to be available but probably not selected, I think this one's a lot less likely, would be Brent Burns of the San Jose Sharks. Now, he's making over $8 million for another 3 years. He's also a little bit older than a lot of the other players we've talked about, but I can see a scenario where the Sharks do expose him and kind of hope that Seattle is willing to take him on. There was some talk quite a while ago that he could be a player that the Kraken would be interested in, but given the amount of money he makes, his age, and I think it's fair to say he's declined in his play the past couple of years as well, I really think that's a lot less likely of a possibility, but he is rumored to certainly be on the list of players that are, bigger names, have a lot of experience making big money that they could get, but I'm not sure that they're going to go down this road as much as, like I said, they're going to be interested in a lot of, D-men. unless they had some kind of a trade worked out with another team to pick him and trade him, which again would be very hard to do. I'm not sure that's going to happen, but he is a player that San Jose likely does expose. I just don't see the Kraken biting on this one. Their top defenseman that could be available would be Calgary Flames captain Mark Giordano, who's down to 1 year left on his deal at $6.75. To me, at his age and where he's at in his career, it doesn't make sense for the Flames to protect him. They're likely going to protect the newly signed Chris Tanev along with Rasmus Andersson and Noah Hanifin. That to me would make more sense. Where Giordano, it's hard to say how long he's going to continue playing. But, clearly the Flames are in for a bit of a shakeup anyway, and I think it makes sense to try to work something out there that he be the guy that goes to Seattle. Now, doesn't mean that they're going to do that for sure, but if he's available, to me, I think Seattle bites on that one because it's only a 1 year contract, so you don't have to worry about a long term that comes with it, like some of the other players we've talked about. It brings a lot of leadership, a great veteran guy, keeps himself in excellent shape. He can still play at a pretty good level, and to me, could possibly be a guy you could consider to be your first captain of the franchise and likely wind things down there. So I think Mark Giordano going to Seattle is a real possibility. It tends to me for the Flames to protect him, but I do think it makes a lot of sense for the Seattle Kraken to consider taking him, even if it's only just for 1 year. Now, another defenseman that's been all around the rumors lately is Duncan Keith. And when the information first broke from Elliot Friedman about Keith likely getting moved from Chicago, he linked the Pacific Northwest or Western Canada as being the likely destinations. Now, I do think that the more likely destination here is that he winds up with the Edmonton Oilers. Based on everything we're hearing, they seem to be the ones that are most interested here, and I do think that a deal is likely going to get worked out. Like, for example, we talked about the fact of the Edmonton Oilers maybe moving Caleb Jones, as well as the Columbus Blue Jackets maybe moving Seth Jones both to Chicago. That's a real possibility, so the brothers can play together, and Duncan Keith could go to Edmonton, which is fairly close to where he wants to be. However, if the Kraken want to be interested here, I do think it's a real possibility that might even work out better for him because his ideal place to be would be near the Vancouver area, which is closest to home where his son and parents are. But at the same time, I think Duncan Keith is still interested in trying to win. And not to say that Seattle can't make some noise from the get-go. I think they can. But it might be more likely that he would prefer to go to a team like Edmonton, who certainly, had a good season last year and have a lot more of the pieces in place to at least try to be a contender. At this point, he has a lot of control due to his contract, and if he doesn't really want to go to Seattle, he won't. But given the fact of the information from Friedman, it looks as though that it's either them or the Oilers. So we'll see what happens, but at $5.5 million for 2 years, it's certainly a scenario that the cap hit isn't great. But if Chicago were to be able to retain, sweeten the deal by adding something else in there to intrigue the Kraken to do it, then he could possibly end up there. And as I mentioned before with Duncan Keith, one thing that's real interesting to think about is that his hit is 5.5, but his cash payout is far less than that. It's a backdiving deal that was done over a long term. He makes $2.1 million for the coming year and only $1.5 in year 2 in his final year of the deal. So even though it's a bigger hit, it's a lot less money out of the pocket of the owner. So it's still something I think they will consider, but I think the Oilers are more likely in this scenario. Now, another big name as well that's not on the blue line would be TJ Oshie, the Washington Capitals. I'm not going to say for sure that this happens, but there has been some linkage that the Capitals clearly are, another team like many, are going to have their fair share of cap issues this offseason. And after a couple of years of not having the success in the playoffs after winning the Stanley Cup, that maybe a shakeup's in order, and that maybe a guy like Oshie would want to go back home to his home state and be an original member of the Seattle Kraken. Now, I know he said differently in the public eye, but as I've mentioned numerous times before, you can't always take what a player says in those kind of public interviews and take it for granted because, you know what, they're not going to come out and say things like that. They don't want to get themselves in a situation where their team thinks they don't want to be there or anything of that nature. So ultimately, it's possible. He has been linked to Coach Dave Haxtell due to their prior relationship at UND. So I do think it's a possibility, but again, I mean, he's been a good player for the Capitals. I do think he's quite content if he ends up staying there. So I'm not going to say that it's any kind of certainty, but if he is interested, I can see there being mutual interest in him being another veteran guy that the Kraken consider bringing in here, either through the expansion draft or possibly through trade afterwards. Another guy to keep your eye on is defenseman Matt Dumba in Minnesota. Of course, the Wild would prefer to keep him, but it's going to be pretty much impossible here given the fact of how this expansion draft is going to work. They're bound to lose a good player no matter how they shake it. They're one of the teams that are going to be a little bit harder hit, and they have 3 defensemen signed longer term with no move clauses that I don't think they'd really want to lose either, so they're not going to ask them to waive. I think the only one they would consider would maybe be Ryan Suter, given the fact he's a bit older, but at the same time, I doubt he's going to want to waive that no move clause and be the guy that gets exposed. So at the end of the day, Dumba is very likely to get traded or claimed, and I think Minnesota knows this, so I do think that there's a good chance that the Kraken might not be able to get their hands on him because he might be traded before he becomes available. But I know there's a lot of teams out there thinking, okay, do we make trades and trade guys that we're really scared to lose, or do we let them go to Seattle but then see Seattle turn around and trade them as well and get a good haul back, which could go to us instead? So they don't want to kind of be made foolish by making moves like that, right? Because at the end of the day, they're going to lose a player, and some teams are just going to take that approach and be like, yeah, whatever, we saw what happened with Vegas. We're just going to let you take a player. We're going to move on and just kind of deal with it from there. And other teams are going to be like, well, yeah, if they're going to take a guy and then turn around and trade him and get a bunch of assets in return, we might as well do that first. Then they can take a player that we are care less about, so to speak, and not be hit so hard. So we'll see what happens. But Dumba's either going to be traded or claimed. I have no doubt. But if he is claimed, he could be a great piece for Ron Francis in Minnesota as well. And lastly here, the big fish that's on the market is going to be the most talked about it all, and I do think Seattle will be to some degree in the mix, would be star center Jack Eichel, the Buffalo Sabres. We know that Eichel is very, very, very likely getting traded in this offseason. Where he goes is difficult to say, but Eichel is a player that, to me, if he were to be traded to Seattle, it would almost certainly have to happen after the expansion draft, because as of right now, they don't have a whole lot of assets. They only have some draft picks for the upcoming draft, and that's really not going to get it done. They're going to have to make some deals to get some high quality other pieces that Buffalo would want. But I do honestly think that they would be interested. I have no doubt. Now, I don't know how they feel about his neck surgery, but still, a big player like that does not come on a trade market very often. If you can start your franchise in year one with your number one center being a quality player like Eichel, I think you have to consider all options to make that happen. But like I said, given the fact that where things are, it's going to be a little tougher to do for them than some teams. But if they make enough deals and they can talk to Buffalo, find out what they want, I could see a scenario unfolding where they obviously draft players strategically through the expansion draft, or maybe make deals with other teams to get guys that Buffalo would want and then make the deal after the fact. That's a real possibility. I don't know how likely that is to happen. I'm going to probably, say it's less likely than a lot of the other guys we've talked about here today, but I can still see a scenario where they're at least interested and are going to see what they can do to make that happen to kick off the franchise. That would be a big way to get their friends excited, making a big splash in the trade market to get such a dynamic player to be on your opening night roster in the very first day for your first game ever. So to me, we'll see what happens, but those are all the bigger names that are likely going to be available either through expansion or trade that the Kraken have been linked to in some capacity, or that I feel they would be very interested in. And then we'll see what happens. Like I said, we're just over 2 weeks away. So let me know which veteran players, how many big ticket items do you see the Kraken taking on day one? Obviously, they're willing to spend to the cap, but let me know what you think makes the most sense in the comments, and we'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with all the latest news and rumors on all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.